just within a few years, typically you'd see the emergence of antibiotic-resistant strains, right? So that's a bummer. Now, like I said, we're even finding strains of what we call multiply resistant strains of bacteria for all sorts of pathogens, right? And so the medical community is becoming much more aware of the fact that they need to be much more careful about using certain last stand, what they call them, antibiotics. They don't want to use some of these antibiotics because they realize if they overuse them, that they're just going to hasten the rate at which these new antibiotic-resistant strains emerge. So there's some worry out there about what they're going to do when somebody comes to their office and they're resistant to everything. They have a bacterial infection that's resistant to everything. That's going to stink, right? And so that's just the observation. We can ask in this class, in this section, why is that the case? Why are we seeing antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria emerging so rapidly after the introduction of these antibiotics? And the answer is, well, the answer is natural selection, but you're going to be dealing with a why. The first thing I want to point out is this is an example of evolution. Okay, this is an example of evolution. You might think it's a trivial example, but it's an example. And what is evolution? It's not that the bacteria themselves, it's not that individual bacteria change over the course of the lifetime of a single bacterium, its resistance. It's rather the composition of the bacterial populations is changing. That is to say, if we could survey a particular species of bacterium in the 1930s before antibiotics were introduced, and we surveyed, that is to say, we tested or did some sort of statistical test to say what fraction of these bacteria are resistant to penicillin, what we'd find out is that almost all of them were not resistant, right? So the composition of the populations of some of these bacteria before the introduction of antibiotics was almost wholly non-resistant bacteria. But by the 50s, 60s, 70s, and today, if you were to do the same experiment, you find out a much larger fraction of the bacteria in these out there, that is to say, the population of bacteria are resistant. So in that sense, evolution is just a change in the frequencies of genes in a population over time. It's a change in a trait over time in a species, not in an individual, but the composition of the species or population is changing over time. Okay? And in that sense, it's a fact. There's nothing controversial about that. Right? So if you hear people complain about whether evolution is true or not, it's true. We can see it. We can see it today. This is an example of the types of observations we can make today. And we have a fossil record that shows us that critters that are alive today were different from the ones that were alive a million years ago, 10 million years ago, 100 million, even a billion years ago. We have a record that goes back that far. Okay? So in that sense, evolution is a fact. Okay? There's a couple other components. So that's just one element of a component of a successful theory of evolution. So there's a couple other things we need to think about. So once you sort of realize that evolution is occurring, one natural question to ask is, well, what is the pattern of change? So the next thing you might ask is, what's the pattern? So this is still a very observational part of evolutionary biology, but it would concern things such as, well, yeah, we're having change, but how rapid is the change, for example, right? So here's an example of two different patterns we might imagine. So let's make a little plot on this x-axis. I'll put a trait. Maybe the trait could be the size of some limb or bone, or in this case, it might be the frequency of antibiotic resistance. And on the y-axis, we'll have time, old, young. So here's one pattern. That would be a pattern of slow, gradual change. Okay? That would be one possible pattern of evolution. And let's see, here'd be another pattern. Okay? That would be a pattern where for a long time you had very little change, then a period where we had rapid change followed by a period where the change occurred more slowly. Those are two different patterns of evolution. Okay? And there's a third, so just want to keep that in mind, that a lot of evolutionary biologists are interested in the pattern of evolution, whether it's rapid or slow, and there's other types of patterns you can document as well. And the final component of a successful theory of evolution is a process, or we can call it a mechanism. And this is the explanation for why the change occurs. What is the process that's behind these changes? Are they just random changes? Are they just random changes in allele frequencies? There's actually a mechanism that we will be discussing in population genetics that discusses random changes of random fluctuations in allele frequencies. It's called genetic drift, just to cut to the chase. But there's other processes as well. And the process that we'll be talking a lot about, because it's the only process that causes adaptation, at least it's the only known process that causes adaptation, is called natural selection. This natural selection is actually responsible for, as an example, the changes in antibiotic resistance over time. We'll be discussing in great detail what natural selection is, and I'll talk a little bit about this lecture too, I hope. All right, so these are the different components of a successful theory of evolution. And one thing that you'll see is some people will point to debate among professional evolutionary biologists such as myself about the pattern of the process, the details of the process, as evidence that the fact of evolution is wrong, right? And that's not fair, right? That's just not fair. Because there's lots of the reason why there's an active field of evolutionary biologists with probably at least 10,000 professional evolutionary biologists worldwide, I don't know how many there really are, but at least 10,000, is because there are open questions about the pattern and process of evolution. But nobody doubts, or very few people at least doubt the fact of evolution, that we have change over time in traits in species or in allele frequencies in species. Okay? So don't let people fool you if they point to, well, this evolutionary biologist is debating that other evolutionary biologist about some detail about that being doubting the fact. Okay. There's another thing I want to mention, and I think there's an interesting line that can be drawn right here. And the line, I don't want this is kind of it's not a very nice way of characterizing things, but the line kind of separates stamp collecting from science, if you will. All right. So we can go out there, and these first two parts, the fact and the pattern, are easy to document. This is just you go out and you look, right, and you document what you see, right. This part is an important part of any science to document what you see, but it doesn't require much theory to do this. Okay. What makes evolutionary biology a science is the fact that we can actually study process and mechanism. Right? We can actually attach mechanisms to changes we see that occurred in the past. But in order to do this, in order to be able to jump across this line, so to speak, we have to make an important assumption. I don't think it's going to be an assumption you guys have a problem with, but it's an assumption that we should state up front. And the assumption is just this, that any processes or mechanisms we see acting today acted in the past. Right? That is the assumption. And like I said, you probably don't have a problem with that assumption. If you do, you can talk to me. But that assumption is a key one. It underlies not only evolutionary biology, but several other historical sciences. So let me name a few of those. It's a very important assumption. It underlies fields such as geology and astronomy. For instance, in geology, you look at the rock record today, you can certainly document where the rocks were, you can characterize what the rock types are, where they are, and so forth. But in order to make it a science, we have to make the assumption that the processes we see working today, such as deposition, that is to say, rocks forming, we can actually see that occurring in the deep sea or at the ends of rivers, in different depositional environments, that processes such as rock deposition or formation and rock erosion that we can see working today, water erosion, wind erosion as examples. Earthquakes would be an example of another process we can witness today, especially here, not now, but in this area. That those processes that we see working today also worked in the past. And those processes are used by geologists to explain the Earth's history. This is geology. Okay? But it requires that assumption. Processes working today also work in the past. It's the same for astronomy. Although the tools, the processes, the assumptions they use in astronomy are that the rules of physics we see working today applied in the past too. Okay? This assumption it's important enough that it actually has a fairly imposing name called uniformitarianism. So uniformitarianism, right? That's the name of the assumption, uniformitarianism. We make a uniformitarian assumption in the field of evolutionary biology that allows us to attach processes such as natural selection to past events. Okay? There's a few things I should mention about uniformitarianism. I actually wrote them down, so I don't want to forget to mention it. So one thing we should do is consider what the alternative to uniformitarianism is. Well, it's pretty simple. That the processes we see today acting or the processes that acted in the past were different from the ones we see acting today. Right? Now, that also has a name. It's a supernaturalism or magic. That's the name for that type of assumption. But basically, it's saying that we can't learn anything about the past from what we see today. Okay? So if you really don't believe this uniformitarian assumption, then we don't have really a baseline to start our discussion with. Okay? So that's one thing, just to consider the alternative. One thing many people mistake uniformitarianism as being equal to slow and gradual. That's not true. Uniformitarianism doesn't necessarily mean slow and gradual change. There's lots of processes out there that are not slow and gradual. Okay? So as an example, in geology, when you see a layer of rock, it's typically not something that formed on a daily basis. It's the 1,000-year flood that causes most rock formation. So if you go out to Claremont Boulevard, I don't know, some of you might bike up and down that road by the Claremont Hotel. That's a pretty fascinating ride because there's some pretty neat road cuts where the rocks are exposed, and you can see the layering of rocks. Actually, you can see the layering of rocks and also the twisting that the rocks have undergone because of earthquakes in this area. But most of the time that you see, so I'll just show you what I'm talking about. So you see these rock layers, right? The rock is here, and you see these, they're separated by like a plane. They're layered. Most of the time is not in the rock. These parts of the rock form actually probably pretty rapidly. Like I said, in those occasional 1,000-year floods, so to speak. Most of the time is in the layers between the rocks where you didn't have any deposition occurring. Right? So in this case, this is not a slow, gradual process. It's something that occurs in a sporadic way. Okay? Asteroids hitting the Earth, we now know, have a pretty major impact on life's history. Right? That is not something that's slow and gradual. That is something that occurs once, and you notice that, and then you have tens of millions of years where you don't have that activity. Thank goodness. Okay? Another example of a process that's not slow and gradual. Okay, and then this uniformitarian assumption doesn't mean that the rules are perfectly understood. All they're saying is the rules, such as they are the same today and yesterday. Okay, but they don't mean that we perfectly understand those rules. I mean, you probably notice there's a large number of different departments in physical and natural sciences on UC Berkeley campus. The reason why you have active researchers in those departments is because we don't know everything. Right? There's a lot of unexplored areas we don't know. Not everything is perfectly understood. And so it doesn't mean that you have to know everything. It's just that whatever those rules are, even as imperfectly as we understand them, work in the past. That's uniformitarianism. And it doesn't mean that things are perfectly predictable either. So there's lots of processes that we think we have a pretty good handle on in terms of what affects the phenomenon, but we don't really know, we can't predict them perfectly. The best example is the weather. Right? So the weather is something that's notoriously difficult to predict. Right? Turns out, as an example, here's a way of predicting tomorrow's weather. Tomorrow's weather is going to be the same as today's weather. It's a perfectly sensible way of predicting tomorrow's weather. Right? The weather tomorrow is going to be precisely like today's weather. It turns out that method of predicting weather does a pretty darn good job. And if you ask a weatherman, somebody who has a lot of experience, has gone to college maybe in atmospheric sciences, and has accumulated a lot of knowledge and has computer models, and you ask them how much better they can do than the simple method I just told you, they can do about 5% better than that. Right? So weather is not. So that doesn't mean the weather is necessarily mysterious. I mean, there's some things we don't understand about it, but we firmly believe that the weather is caused by atmospheric chemistry and physics. Right? We don't think there's anything mysterious happening. We think we have the general idea of the rules that govern the weathers, but we don't understand basically some processes are so complicated that you can't perfectly predict them. They're stochastic to some extent. So uniformitarianism doesn't mean that things are perfectly predictable too. Okay? I wanted to get that out there. That's what time we have. Okay, so we have some time still. So I want to go a little bit back to the explanation that the bottom line, the most important process that we have, and that's natural selection. I just want to finish up my discussion of the antibiotic resistance story, and get you some idea of what the natural selection explanation is. And so natural selection works on, or it's actually a pretty simple idea, but it assumes that there's variation among individuals in a population for some characteristic. Okay, so variation in our case would be related to antibiotic resistance. And it's important to think about antibiotic. You might want to put the screen up here so people in other rooms can see. So it's important to think about antibiotic resistance is not a yes/no phenomenon, but a more or less type of phenomenon. So you can have bacteria that differ in their ability to grow in the presence of a particular antibiotic by different amounts. And so this is just showing you a slide where we've shown you how people can actually measure antibiotic resistance. What you're seeing is the person's holding a plate up to the light. This greenish tinge, that's the bacterial lawn. And what are these? These are little paper filters that the researcher has impregnated, soaked in a specific antibiotic. Right? So what they do is they soak the little paper filter in the antibiotic, and then with the tweezers they set this little disc, this paper disc on the plate, on the aggro of the plate. And what you imagine is that there's a gradient of antibiotic. It's most concentrated at the disc, but as you go further and further away from the disc, that the antibiotic becomes less and less concentrated. Okay? And you can also see from this picture the zone of inhibition. You can see that the bacteria for this disc are growing right up to this point. Right? They seem to be growing pretty well up to here, but not so well in this area. Okay? And you'll notice too that there's different sized holes in these lawns. In this particular case, I don't know if it's probably because the concentration of the antibiotic in the discs is different. But if you can control for how much antibiotic you put into the disc, then you can actually measure antibiotic resistance as the size of that hole in the bacterial lawn. So the top one is an example of a clone of bacteria that are not particularly resistant to the antibiotic. You'll see that the zone of inhibition is quite big. That would be interpreted as a low concentration of the antibiotic can kill the bacteria. Okay? Down here, we're looking at what you might call resistant bacteria. The zone of inhibition is much smaller. It doesn't take, it takes a lot of antibiotic to kill these, to inhibit the growth of this bacterial clone. Okay? So you can measure antibiotic resistance. You could go out into nature, culture, basically pick out single bacteria, grow them in a flask, such that you have enough to plate out and measure the resistance of individual bacteria if you really wanted to, because they're clonal. Okay? And what you would find is there's variation. There's variation in antibiotic resistance in different species of bacteria out in nature. Okay? Another important piece of natural selection is that the variation is heritable. That is to say, whatever that characteristic is, antibiotic resistance, height in humans, for instance, or whatever the characteristic is, that you pass that trait onto your offspring. Right? That there's heritability in that trait. It doesn't have to be perfect inheritance, but it has to be heritable. Another part of the theory is differential survival or reproductive success. That is to say that this variation that we're seeing, let's say in antibiotic resistance, has to be tied to the success of the organism, in this case bacteria, to reproduce or survive. Okay, so you have a heritable trait, as an example, antibiotic resistance, that allows you to grow in the presence of bacteria, in the presence of antibiotic. That would be an example. If you're in a mixed culture, some of the bacteria are less resistant to the antibiotic, some are more resistant. Then, in the presence of the antibiotic, you will see more survival and reproduction by those that have the resistance mutations, and that results in natural selection. Okay, these are the different components of natural selection. We'll talk about it much more later in lecture, and we'll even give you a mathematical treatment of the process. But that's the basic explanation for antibiotic resistance. Next lecture, we'll talk about Darwin and the origin of the theory.